There we go. So this is Ariel Davis, and Ariel is like his classmates, his panelists, a student at the University of Western Ontario. He's in his senior year, and he is obtaining a degree in history in the honors specialization module. His main historical fields of interest are economic and Jewish history. He's had a lifelong passion for politics and government, and he plans to work in legislative affairs after graduating. But before doing so, he is planning on pursuing a master's degree in public policy after he graduates from his undergraduate, with his undergraduate degree. He is currently an assistant editor for The Mirror, which is his university's undergraduate history journal. And he's also been published in the General Assembly, which, Ariel, I'm assuming is another publication of the university. Well done. So he will be presenting on the following topic: examining the financial system of Britain's informal empire in the 19th century. So Ariel, I think, is going to be doing this with a PowerPoint presentation. All right, it's all yours, Ariel.
Thank you all for coming. Without further ado, I will begin. Good morning. Following the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815, economic progress made through capitalist free market modernization and the Industrial Revolution had expanded the size of the British economy well in excess of the production capacity of other European powers. During the Victorian era, the British Empire had the largest, wealthiest, and most advanced economy in the world. The challenge of maintaining economic superiority became a high priority for Britain, but conventional growth opportunities for a power as large as Britain's empire were scarce. Although the British Empire possessed more resources and produced greater outputs than any other imperial power, they were consequently burdened with an expectation for continuous growth. Fortunately, during the 1800s, several significant innovations in finance were integrated into the British Empire to sustain their global economic dominance. The advancements in finance both expanded the size of the empire and changed the operational structure of the imperial model, which had previously been based on outdated notions of mercantilism and hard power. This essay will analyze these advancements in Britain's financial sector, with specific focus on free trade, credit expansion, and the stock market. Furthermore, this paper will attempt to demonstrate how these 19th century financial developments furthered Britain's imperial interests, transforming their empire into a modern political economy. One of the most revolutionary fiscal concepts of the 19th century was the implementation of free trade as a means of advancing imperial interests. The cost of maintaining Britain's colonies frequently outweighed the revenue streams they created for their empire. However, access to the raw materials used to meet consumer demands, such as Canadian beaver pelts and Virginia tobacco, still had to be available for Britain's import and export markets. Britain's militaristic presence in regions such as Australia, Asia, and the Americas had been a pillar of their formal imperial model, which enabled them to exploit resources and exert influence over the land's indigenous and settlement populations. However, as Britain's political and martial dominion in these colonies declined throughout the Victorian era, the British Empire had to develop a new strategy to maintain influence in these resource-rich areas. By the 1790s, classical liberal thinkers such as Adam Smith had proposed free trade as a solution to this problem, but the concept was not implemented until 1840s. The Manchester School, fierce advocates of capitalism, successfully argued that mercantilism was restraining the economic capacity of the British Empire. Members of the movement, such as Richard Cobden and John Bright, believed that free trade would be the economic catalyst that liberated the imperial economy. By the 1850s, the British government had undertaken significant efforts to achieve virtually unfettered free trade economy. In 1846, the Corn Laws were repealed, which eliminated many tariffs on grain and other traded crops, ultimately reducing prices and making food more accessible to many people and socioeconomic classes in the empire. Between 1830 and 1860, Britain's average tariff rate on total imports had been reduced from over 30% to under 15%, as demonstrated in this line right here. This enabled merchants to import goods and raw materials from across their empire at comparatively inexpensive prices. Additionally, as the world's largest industrialized nation, Britain could cheaply and efficiently refine and then re-export goods at higher prices. During this period, it has been estimated that Britain's industrial output accounted for half of the manufacturing needs of France, Germany, and Belgium. However, Britain's largest trading partners remained members of their own empire, including India, Canada, Australia, and Hong Kong. In 1867, Britain's exports to imperial colonies and commonwealths amounted to 50 million British pounds, which is roughly over 5 trillion British pounds today, with India accounting for slightly less than 1/2 of this demand. This figure also represented just over 1/3 of Britain's total exports and demonstrates the magnitude of British trade and economic power in the mid-1800s. As historians John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson argue in their influential paper, The Imperialism of Free Trade, the impact of free trade in Britain's informal empire expanded their sphere of influence as effectively as aggressive formal imperial tactics had done. As Britain's informal empire evolved, its proponents incorporated interventionist tools such as military force and economic leverage, and were mostly used as instruments of last resort. Although international conflicts in pursuit of Britain's imperial interests, like the Opium Wars of the 1840s, persisted throughout the 1800s, some scholars asserted that these scrimmages would have been avoided by Britain's political leadership. According to Galbraith's man-on-the-spot theory, these violent outbreaks were often caused by tensions between non-imperial native populations and individuals loosely affiliated with the empire, such as merchants, privateers, and adventurers. These quasi-imperial entities used their positions within the informal empire to pursue imperial expansion for personal gain, often with disregard for the empire's official mandate of soft power diplomacy. One example of these rogue opportunists was Charles Mason, an imperial customs clerk and pseudo-adventurer in China, who was involved in a failed uprising against the Chinese government in 1891. According to Mason's writings and testimony during his trial, he was a swashbuckling adventurer that was part of a motley crew fighting against the oppressive regime of the Qing government in pursuit of prosperity and in service to the crown. In reality, Mason was motivated by greed and fame, and the judge overseeing his trial believed he was mentally deranged. The events of the unsuccessful revolt can be summarized as fantastical delusions of grandeur, which included an anti-Qing society. The relevant lessons from the Mason affair revealed the fragility of Britain's informal empire. Mason's errant actions led to a major rearrangement between Britain and China that relegated Britain's access to resources and trade beyond their territories in Hong Kong and Macau. While this diplomatic resolution was not ideal for Britain or China, it demonstrated the merits of the informal empire through the economic ties it created. The British diplomats were able to distance themselves from Mason, and commercial cooperation between the two nations mostly persisted despite heightened tensions. Additionally, Mason's treacherous actions might have been viewed by the Qing government as a British act of aggression, an imperial conquest, and possibly justified another international war. Free trade was a significant part of Britain's economic growth during the Victorian era, both at home and abroad. The liberal values of informal imperial model enabled the British Empire to produce greater outputs and develop stronger ties with nations inside and outside the scope of their empire. Furthermore, it mitigated the risks and inefficiencies of formal imperial oversight and legal title. Stronger diplomatic and economic relations created by free trade frequently prevailed in crises caused by individuals driven by fictitious formal imperial glory. While free trade was the driving force behind Britain's informal imperial growth, rapid developments in monetary policy and credit expansion were the vehicles which financed the 19th century trade and economic boom. Throughout the 1800s, there was an intense debate over the issuance of coinage in Britain and the imperial implications of various current forms of currency. Radicals like William Cobbett disavowed paper notes as a crime against the gullible poor. In his speech, Paper Against Gold, he declared that the immaterial value of this exchange would impoverish the population. He feared that there would not be enough physical currency to cover all the Bank of England's exposure if too many people converted their notes to material exchanges at the same time. However, Jerry McCullough, who was a leading advocate for the credit economy, praised the system as a driving force for Britain's dominance in the realm of international finance. In 1832, McCullough and his peers vigorously defended the credit-based mediums of exchange, including paper banknotes, bills of exchange, accommodation bills, and checks. McCulloch challenged the notion that these credit instruments were supported by immaterial value, and he further argued that they were all backed by confidence in Britain and the security of her imperial holdings and assets. Initially, Britain backed their currency using precious metals, with silver and gold as the main modes of exchange. However, as demand for these metals in other nations increased throughout the 18th century, unscrupulous individuals melted coinage into raw materials and exported it across the globe. This depletion in Britain's precious metal reserves caused extreme inflation and price fluctuations in Britain's currency rates, while wages, borrowing rates, and the cost of goods soared to unaffordable levels, as demonstrated in this by this arrow. This depletion, additionally, the cost of the Napoleonic Wars forced the British government to constantly increase their national debt, and by 1814, the figure had risen to £679 million, which was twice the nation's GDP. Britain tried several reforms in the early 19th century to stabilize the currency, such as implementing a coinage backed solely by gold. However, the economic strains which had forced the Bank of England to halt all cash payments between 1797 and 1821 caused severe damage to the imperial economy. After this period, which has been called the Restriction Era, credit in the British economy became plentiful again. The end of the war and the substitution of paper notes backed by the Bank of England over various precious metals made credit highly accessible. By the Victorian era, British financiers who had made fortunes by financing the war used the capital from their matured war bonds to fund international ventures. Projects like the Suez Canal and large investments in Latin America, which extended Britain's imperial influence, were financed heavily through debt purchased in London trading houses. By the 1870s, Britain's return on foreign investment alone accounted for 5% of Britain's GDP, and that figure does not include the output increases produced by these ventures, such as optimizing supply chains or establishing new trading ports. While the concept of credit had existed for centuries, the scale at which it was utilized and embraced throughout Britain and its empire transformed the British imperial economy into a financial and political power with unprecedented size and influence. The extensive circulation of credit between the 1820s and 1870s allowed Britain's national and imperial economies to grow through borrowed capital. Domestically, access to credit stimulated Britain's economy, as farmers and businessmen were able to easily borrow money to expand their operations or finance regular purchases. Internationally, the credit economy had greater significance for merchants and financiers, as credit instruments created an opportunity to reduce risk while increasing yields. Previously, merchants could only realize profits after they sold their inventory at high markups. However, volatile commodity prices significantly impacted their margins and potential earnings. Through credit instruments such as bills of exchange, banks could issue a loan underwriting the merchant's assumed risk and pay them the full value of the imported goods up front. This influx of capital enabled merchants to finance their lifestyles and import more goods, while banks can make a substantial profit through interest and speculating the future value of the assets. Banks usually used rational thought and mathematics to determine the future value of their securities, either holding the debt until it was due or selling it to another market speculator. While these securities were still susceptible to the price fluctuations of the underwritten commodities, they significantly reduced the financial limitations of a strictly cash-based economy. This speculative cycle of purchasing, appraising, and reselling, as demonstrated in this chart, was a staple of England's credit economy. By 1860, England had grown their international credit network to become the largest trading nation in the world. Between 1851 and 1911, Britain's trade deficit had risen fivefold, from £27 million to £134 million. Granted, much of this wealth creation was based on arbitrary speculation. However, the material returns of the commodity-driven market sustained itself. The goods imported could be efficiently refined and redistributed at higher prices, while the circulation of credit and accumulation of resources worked in conjunction to provide material gains and demonstrated the system's overall success. As commerce became increasingly globalized and complex throughout the 18th and 19th century, the London Stock Exchange was founded in 1800 to organize and facilitate trades and transactions in financial markets. While Britain had a securities exchange in the 18th century, it was open and unregulated, which made it highly susceptible to fraud and irrational behavior. Conversely, the London Stock Exchange was organized under a set of rules that dictated how business was conducted and who qualified as a market participant. This refinement in securities trading was well timed, as the French Revolution caused disruptions to Europe's other financial hubs in Paris and Amsterdam, and their financial talent and capital quickly relocated to Britain. Additionally, the expansion of national debt to fund the Napoleonic Wars increased the pool of government-backed securities available to the public, which was an enticing opportunity for British investors. The number of market participants in the LSE continued to grow with the size of Britain's national debt, and between 1815 and 1819, the exchange membership had risen from 541 to 737, while national debt rose from 744 to 844 million pounds, as demonstrated in these two slides. By 1858, the LSE had nearly 1,000 members, demonstrated despite the fact that the debt had not grown since 1820 and was even decreasing as a percent of GDP. The divergence between these figures demonstrates how LSE members found new ways to make money through investments through the exchange. The imperial merits of the stock exchange became apparent in the 1820s as the debt stagnation forced traders to find opportunities outside of Britain to invest capital. In 1823, over 623 multinational joint stock companies, which would be classified as limited liability corporations today, were listed on this exchange. The expansion of foreign investment created economic interests, which expanded the empire's presence in these regions and influenced their development and structure. These international ventures included railroad projects and mining firms, while developing nations like Brazil, Colombia, and Chile issued loans on the stock exchange's foreign securities market to raise capital. Despite several panics between 1825 and 1878, often caused by speculative bubbles, defaults on national debt, and overextended traders, the joint stock companies and foreign investment funds continued to gain significant investment throughout the 1800s. In 1835, 10 years after the first major panic, British Parliament passed legislation which created the foreign funds market as an extension of the LSE. This allowed investors to continue purchasing shares of foreign entities in debt, but reduced the risk of these assets defaulting or dragging the whole market down in a bubble. By the mid-19th century, several other significant pieces of legislation were passed, which helped the LSE become the largest stock exchange in the world and subsequently established Britain as an unrivaled global financial power. The Bank Charter Renewal Act and New Company Law, passed in 1844 and 1856 respectively, repealed regulations that restricted many businesses from being incorporated as joint stock companies. This made the process of registering as a public company listed on the LSE much easier. The growth in industry and wealth created by this legislation occurred throughout the mid-late 1800s. In 1897, 24,000 joint stock companies worth over 1.3 billion pounds, which is over 170 billion pounds today, in investment, were quoted on the LSE. This figure represented over a fifth of Britain's GDP and was more than twice the value of the combined investment in French and German equity markets. The development of the LSE and the legislation which enabled it to grow helped Britain cement her status as a global economic and political superpower. The stock exchange provided an avenue for British capital to purchase debt and fund infrastructure projects in developing countries, which created economic ties and leverage for Britain in the emergent world. Despite some inherent flaws in the system, the LSE, as a facilitator of commerce and debt, was a key factor in the British Empire transitioning from a formal to informal structure. The British imperial economy experienced multiple financial crises throughout the 1800s, including several major panics, recessions, and rampant fraud. While the economic innovations that occurred throughout this era contributed to these challenges, they also provided the tools that ultimately led to sustained prosperity for Britain throughout this era. Affordable goods, accessible credit, and wealth creation are all products of these Victorian-era financial developments that work together to maintain British imperial economic superiority during booms and busts in their capitalist cycle. Furthermore, by intertwining their economy and financial interests with other nations, the British Empire successfully positioned themselves as the economic bellwether of the world. Thank you.
Okay, let me just... how do I... Okay, I've removed the spotlight, but I still just see you. So, oh, here we go. Let's see. Okay, thank you very much, Ariel. Again, please type in questions, attendees, audience members, when some come to mind, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our second speaker is Jade Spears. She also is a student. She's at the University of Western Ontario. She's in her 4th year, and she's in honors specialization in history and is also doing a minor in classical studies. After she graduates, she is planning to pursue a master's and a PhD in the intellectual and cultural history of Britain during the 18th and 19th centuries. She has published in the 2 journals that Ariel has also published in, the Mirror and the General Assembly at the University of Western Ontario. And she has also been the recipient of a number of scholarships. So congratulations. And so her paper is on Montesquieu's influence on Tocqueville. So a great French thinker of the 1700s and his influence on a great French thinker of the 1800s. Okay, Jade, I'm going to put the spotlight on you. All right, it's all yours, Jade.
Thank you. From the late 17th century to the early 19th century, the Enlightenment era in Europe was characterized by intellectuals who questioned political and social institutions and practices through the use of reason. One such intellectual was Montesquieu, who wrote his revolutionary work, Spirit of the Laws, in 1748. His work attempted to provide a rational and scientific account of why each nation had its own particular laws, institutions, and customs. Almost 100 years later, in 1835 and 1840, Tocqueville published his 2-volume work, Democracy in America. Tocqueville's aims in these books was to study the consequences of democracy and how to mitigate them. When one studies both the Spirit of the Laws and Democracy in America, it becomes clear that Tocqueville's interpretation of American government and society was heavily influenced by Montesquieu's work. In my paper, I argue that this influence is evident in his comparative method and views of national character, approach and characterizations, and in his research questions, such as what are the consequences of democracy? How does a nation safeguard against tyranny, individualism, and materialism? And how is religion consistent with liberty? However, in this presentation, I will examine how the central similarity between the 2 authors, the preservation of liberty. In today's society, as in the time of Montesquieu and Tocqueville, the questions, what are the limits of liberty and how is it endangered, are of utmost concern. The most recent example has occurred with this pandemic, in which government mandates are seen as an attack on the liberties of a democratic society. This problem raises the questions of how far liberty should be sacrificed for the well-being of others, and what checks do a society possess to moderate federal power, or should there be any? Montesquieu and Tocqueville ask similar questions in their works, including what elements endanger liberty? What are the dangers of individualism and materialism? And how can nations safeguard against tyranny and limit the exercise of power? To understand these classifications, we must first look at these questions, we must first look at their political classifications. Montesquieu uses 3 political categories: republics, monarchies, and despotisms, with republics being split into democracies and aristocracies. Montesquieu praised and criticized monarchies and the British form of republic, as well as outlined the dangers of despotisms. He praised monarchies for being the only government that was by definition moderate. He asserted them to have their own form of liberty and possessing honor as the spring that makes it move. Montesquieu criticized them for the excesses he saw at court, such as arrogance and politeness. Republics were praised for using representative legislators, a bicameral system, and separated functional powers to balance the English Constitution, thereby balancing partisan passions and the operation of functional powers. They possess virtue as a spring, which is the Republican love of homeland and equality. Republics were criticized for their individualistic nature. Montesquieu examined how to preserve liberty in different forms of government, like in British republics and monarchies, identifying how to mitigate the effects of commerce and despotisms. Tocqueville uses 2 political categories, democracies and aristocracies. Although these categories seem different from Montesquieu's, Tocqueville further divides democracies into moderate and despotic democracies. Additionally, the way he refers to aristocracies resembles Montesquieu's monarchy category. Thus, Tocqueville uses the same 3 categories as Montesquieu. Tocqueville sought to answer how to have a democratic society without the tyranny and the lack of social fabric exhibited in post-revolutionary France. His vision of a despotic democracy came from his fear of Robespierre and Napoleon, who abused the liberty of republics to act as tyrants. He discusses the old aristocracy's refusal to accept new power, the suspicion of the democrats towards the nobility, and the wrongful hatred of religion. His aim in this investigation was designed to help France transform into a despotic republic into a moderate one. Montesquieu believed that despotisms and commerce endangered liberty through creating tyranny, individualism, and materialism. He claims that despotism breaks down the social fabric of a nation, leading to harsh tyrannical laws that destroy a nation's national character. This destruction makes people slaves in public and tyrants in private. He claims there are two types of tyranny, the violence of the government and of opinion. The tyranny of opinion is the imposition of the ruling class's will upon a people who think differently from themselves. Montesquieu attributes individualism to commerce and uses nations such as England as an example. These nations' mores and institutions lead its citizens to be proud and live mostly by themselves. Their works would reflect a withdrawn people who think alone. He says that materialism endangers liberty by causing people to sell it in order to protect industry. Tocqueville likewise sees tyranny, individualism, and materialism as endangering liberty. He describes tyranny as tyranny of the majority, an extreme version of democracy. Tocqueville claimed that the love of equality has disinclined people to believe that some are smarter than others, and so they use numbers as a form of intellectual legitimacy. In this tyranny, the majority attacks those who disagree with them, excluding them from society until they give in to the crowd. This creates a groupthink which would not permit dissent and would be very dangerous. Tocqueville criticized the American division of powers because all branches of the American government were controlled by the majority. This allowed them to create and execute laws with extreme rapidity, making the political situation in America unstable. He is also similar to Montesquieu in assessing the dangers of individualism, stating that Americans have been taught since infancy to rely on themselves, to mistrust authority, and to not accept assistance if it can be avoided. This is the effect of sapping public virtue and severely reducing political participation, as well as making ambitions low and materialistic. Tocqueville believed that the Americans' materialistic desire for physical well-being would endanger liberty by convincing them to give up their political rights in exchange for order so that industry can function. What these people do not realize, according to Tocqueville, is that industry can only thrive through liberty. Thus, Montesquieu and Tocqueville both believe that liberty is endangered by tyranny, individualism, and materialism. To safeguard against tyranny, individualism, and materialism, Tocqueville and Montesquieu advocate for the division of powers, intermediary bodies, commerce, and religion. The division of powers is described at length by Montesquieu in his discussion of Britain, and it involves making sure the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of government are not all controlled by one group of people, which would result in tyranny. Tocqueville analyzed the division of powers in America through this lens. He looked towards local governments and claimed its legislative power allowed for more reflection and discussion before a law is passed because it was divided into two branches and was moderated by a governor who had executive power. The judiciary system was autonomous on the federal level and so avoided the danger of legislative tyranny. However, it is still criticized by Tocqueville because everything was controlled by the majority. Outside of British republics, Montesquieu looks towards society to safeguard against tyranny. The most effective intermediary power discussed in his work was the nobility, who checked the monarch's power not through force, but through creating small barriers. He gives the example of the Viscount of Ort, who refused to massacre the Huguenots after St. Bartholomew's Day on King Charles IX's orders because he viewed it as dishonorable. The power of the monarch was limited here by the aristocracy and the spring of honor. Tocqueville likewise looks to society for checks against tyranny and gives associations, newspapers, and lawyers as intermediate powers in America. Associations act as an artificial aristocracy and were created by the minority. They reduce the amount of instability discussed above by petitioning and debating the majority to slow down the rate at which legislation is changed, and it also gives the minority the confidence to challenge the majority as they gain in number. Newspapers aid in informing associations because they carry news around the nation and into the homes of individuals who may be like-minded. Lawyers formed a new kind of aristocracy in America that acted as intermediaries as well. They shared similar tastes with typical aristocracies and held themselves as superior to the rest of the nation. The lawyer class opposed many elements of the democratic system in America and thus acted as a counterweight to the majority. Local governments and associations also help to safeguard against individualism. They organize society at a local level, drawing Americans out of their isolation to work within the community in order to protect their own interests. Since the majority rules America, individuals are too weak to accomplish their goals on their own. They need numerous supporters from their community. Because they need people within their communities to institute change, they are forced to treat their neighbors with kindness and respect. While commerce endangers liberty, Montesquieu recognizes that it also possesses factors that help protect it. He describes commerce as moderating tyranny through the return of what he called barbarian liberty. Commercialism forced governments to be moderate because if they tried to tax their people too heavily, the people would move their money and property to another nation through bills or letters of exchange. This made goods invisible and inaccessible to the state. Tocqueville likewise mentions the mobile nature of the American people in seeking wealth. This fact can further Montesquieu's arguments because if a person's local government implements rules they dislike, they can leave with their property. Finally, both Montesquieu and Tocqueville believe that religion returns a sense of community to individuals and moves them towards immaterial pleasures. Montesquieu declared that religion moderates greed, self-interestedness, and short-sightedness that arises from commerce. He also says that religion produces morals and that it regulates society so that government does not have to be tyrannical and implement harsh rules. He believes that religion should be based on works instead of contemplation, as contemplation breeds excessive speculation, causes political indifference, detachment, and passivity. Tocqueville asserts that democratic nations tend towards materialism and the pursuit of material ideals, but that the simultaneous cultivation of the mind men would lose the ability to improve themselves and produce ideals. Christianity teaches its disciples that they must benefit their neighbors and love them even more than themselves. He states that religion gives people the ability to conduct themselves with the future in mind. It uses this view of the future to implement religious morals into their political institutions and communities, seeking to maintain them through works instead of contemplation. In this way, religion reduces individualism and materialism. There are many ways in which Montesquieu influenced Tocqueville. Indeed, when one studies Tocqueville in depth and then turns to Montesquieu in depth and then turns to Tocqueville, one cannot help but find him in almost every page. But the most important similarity between them is their concern with the preservation of liberty. Through these authors, our own society can learn how to identify how the majority and ruling class threaten liberty and social cohesion. They also show how the corruptions of commerce and democracy create an individualistic and materialistic society that removes the feeling of obligations that we have to one another. However, Montesquieu and Tocqueville also show us how to overcome these issues. Every system needs checks and balances, but no one system has the true answer of how these must be implemented. We cannot retreat into our own private lives and ignore the world around us. We need institutions that encourage tolerance and ideals that bring us together. To progress ourselves, our communities, and our world, we must as a society work together and sacrifice some of our own interests in the benefit of everyone. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I am going to now highlight Lucy. Okay, thank you very much, Jade. And I've got to undo. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jade. I'm looking forward to discussing your paper as well with everybody after we've concluded the three presentations. Our third and final presenter today is Lucy Warrington, and she's joining us from across the Atlantic, which is very exciting, made possible only by this technology. So welcome. She spent a year, her third year at the University of Western Ontario, but she is in her fourth and final year of her undergraduate degree at St. Andrews in Scotland, and she is pursuing a degree in economics and modern history. But she actually completed this paper during her year at the University of Western Ontario. She is hoping, after completing her undergraduate degree, she is planning to go on and get a graduate degree in history, but has yet to determine at which institution. So I'm going to turn it over now to you, Lucy. And your paper Your is titled Victoria Crosses to a Painted Pantaloon, the impact of press reporting on the Crimean War.
Okay, I'll just put the PowerPoint on. That should be it. Okay. The editor of the Morning Advertiser, James Grant, exclaimed in 1871 that the glorious mission of the press is to enlighten, to civilize, and to morally transform the world. The power of the media today is taken for granted, and a patchwork quilt of information is available within a few clicks of a button. However, during the Crimean War, the explosion of details distributed by the press was a cultural phenomenon. This paper discusses press reporting's rise to prominence and how the birth of war correspondence enabled meticulously detailed accounts of the war zone to be published, shocking readers at home. It will then examine the impact of these commentaries on the changing perceptions of the British public, the military, and the government. By analysing the growth and impact of media coverage, it is clear press reports of the Crimean War transformed the media into a fiercer social and political force, and was a hugely influential factor in aiding British forces in the Crimea and producing long-term effects for news reporting. It is first important to discuss newspapers' evolution into the primary form of news consumption amongst Britons. The 1851 Great Exhibition primed citizens to ready themselves for innovations, including electrotyping and the steam-driven printing press, which cut down printing times and larger circulations of newspapers became feasible. In the 1800s, improvements of literacy rates became a social priority, achieved through church Sunday schools, charity schools, and factory acts, whilst the Public Libraries Act of 1850 gave access to reading material for free. By 1851, 18 million Britons could read and write, and the demand for literature and newspapers increased. Middle-class politicians hoped newspapers would be educational self-help agents, which could integrate working classes into society and reduce crime. So the newspaper tax on knowledge was repealed in 1855. The explosion of this industry was immense. In 1850, newspapers circulated a few hundred or a few thousand. However, by 1855, the price had markedly fallen and readership of some established newspapers rose to the tens of thousands. The Illustrated London News doubled its audience from 100,000 to 200,000 per week, giving readers graphic glimpses into world events, whilst greatly complementing the reports of war correspondents, just as the growth of cities, railways, steamboats, and the telegraph made foreign news more accessible. One newspaper company, The Times, dominated the daily newspaper industry to an unprecedented degree. In the early 1850s, it issued around 40,000 copies and had 250,000 subscribers during the Crimean War, greater than the collective circulation of all its rivals. Many called the Times the Thunderer, emphasizing its influential power. Therefore, this newspaper will be principally analysed to explain the influence of the press over proceedings in the Crimea. Britain was still largely governed by aristocrats, and historian Stephanie Markovits cites that the Times presumed to speak not only for that class, but also to represent the rising and as yet less influential bourgeoisie. The character of newspaper publications indicate a united British readership, and citizens were more informed than in any previous conflict. Before war reports filtered back home, Britons were enthusiastic about fighting and were swept along by the seemingly inexorable tide of enthusiasm for the war. However, detailed accounts of war correspondence drastically changed public opinion. War correspondent for the London Daily News, Edwin Lawrence Godkin, argues that the creation and establishment of special correspondence was the most important result of the Crimean War. William Russell, employed by the Times, was the first person devoted to conflict reporting, and his bronze bust in St. Paul's Cathedral labels him the first and greatest of war correspondents. Although the military monopoly on the telegraph meant it was relatively inaccessible for journalists, reports were disseminated faster than previous wars, and citizens felt they were updated in real time. Articles from the British camp offered unprecedented amounts of warfare information, describing oversights and mistakes of the British Army, which worried readers. Russell's Battle of Balaclava report in October 1854 described the desperate valour, far indeed from its far indeed removed from its so-called better part, discretion, of the charge of the Light Brigade. The incident would have staged just another catastrophe in public awareness if it were not for his eloquent prowess. Russell's reports used novelistic practices of detail and serialization which enticed readers, and historian Joseph Matthews comments that compared to those of his competitors, Russell's Crimean letters are gems of brilliance. War reporting was the main priority for newspapers, and correspondents delved into striking detail with their accounts, attracting an alarmed public reaction. Russell was banned from battlefields due to his damning reports, so instead asked soldiers for details. Instead of describing battles, he conveyed social problems behind the fighting, portraying his stance on the side of the common soldier. The pacifist attitude of the Times is shown by searching the keyword peace in their digital archive. A conspicuous increase is seen from 1855 to 1856, from 2007 articles to 2,660. Conceivably, the paper was not just expressing public opinion, but dictating it. Nevertheless, conflict was no longer the exclusive concern of sovereigns and statesmen. The degree of war reporting was unprecedented, and newspapers triggered debates between citizens and government. The exposure of correspondence was so profound that Prince Albert employed Roger Fenton to take counter-propaganda images to help restore public confidence. His photography was shown at public events, providing insights into what war was like. Despite efforts of obscuring the severity of war, Fenton's photographs could not hide awful living conditions. His piece, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, as shown on the screen, showed the extent of shell fire and the barren badlands, providing a link for press reports and creating surges of empathy for soldiers. People questioned why the war was being fought, and British leaders were worried about the impact of newspapers as they developed into provocative and reactive channels of information, capable of sparking strong sentiments amongst citizens. The desire for news was stimulated as reports increased and the war progressed, but the government did not give Britons anything more than standard dispatches. Pamphlets were used more than newspapers during the Napoleonic Wars, giving fewer opportunities for written participation. Now, Russell's columns were commented on by citizens in the very newspaper he wrote for, establishing a collaborative forum. People felt obliged to express their ideas, generating early instances of crowdsourcing. For example, a practical farmer expressed how, as a practical man, he may venture to give an opinion regarding the maintenance of horses. The public started a political discourse aimed at improving the conditions at the front and themselves becoming part of the war. The Times used the word "we" frequently, supporting perceptions it spoke for the people. Political scientist and historian Benedict Anderson argued the experience of reading a newspaper created an imagined community known as the nation. However, illustrations of the time often show groups gathered around newspapers, inferring dialogues in the outside world were held after reading. John Leach's Punch illustration, as shown on the screen, shows the paterfamilias rendering diverse reactions to the charge of the Light Brigade. It demonstrates Britons, whether by joining in with the action or averting it, were all part of a physically evidenced community, dismissing Anderson's claim that this unity is purely imagined. Citizens were drawn into the discussion as anyone could be a hero, a home front fighter in the People's War. Citizens were eager to help, and the Times Crimean Fund for the relief of the sick and wounded was set up. Sparked by newspaper reports of appalling medical facilities, the fund proved critical and raised over £7,000 in the first week, enabling Florence Nightingale to purchase medicines for British hospitals in Scutari, and also providing odd luxuries, including fur coats and rubber boots. A countrywide knitting campaign to provide warm clothes for the soldiers occurred, which even the Queen's daughters participated in. Citizens at home were inspired by reports to do their bit for the war effort, instigating a wave of voluntary service to help the military. The quality of food for soldiers was also greatly enhanced by private enterprise. Alexis Soyer was very prominent in improving food rationing and provided recipes which were published in newspapers. Motivated to help after reading reports about hospital conditions in Scutari, he travelled to the Crimea and ran kitchens in Balaclava Hospital, cooking daily for more than 2,000 men. Mary Seacole was determined to assist and set up a hotel in the Crimea, providing supplies including meals and medicines. Here, soldiers could enjoy comforts that reminded them of home. Many private enterprises and public initiatives were inspired by newspaper accounts to help with the war effort and made the Crimea a more comfortable habitation for soldiers. After the war, newspapers participated in further campaigns related to the Crimea. When the press learned of Mary Seacole declaring bankruptcy in 1856, the Illustrated London News, Punch, and the Times organised a fund which raised money to help her, further portraying its influence on public actions and opinions. Newspaper companies also created a recognition for bravery, which had strong support from the Queen, who helped with the design. Though the military leadership protested, they acquiesced to public opinion and royal requests. The Victoria Cross was instigated in January 1856, and the Queen personally pinned the awards onto 62 veterans who fought in the Crimea. The public reaction to press reports was immense. The people were stirred by newspapers to do all they could to aid the war effort and provided soldiers with better resources and facilities when they were in British camps, whilst also recognising their sacrifice and bravery after the Crimean War ended. Press reports forced the military to reassess management and leadership, resulting in a transformation of their operations. The power of Russell's accounts was owed to lack of censorship. Russell attacked Lord Raglan, the commander of the British troops, viciously, blaming him for the failures at Inkerman and Balaclava, and accused him of being influenced by the French at Sevastopol, whilst the army was constantly described as unorganised and mismatched. Queen Victoria was not happy with newspaper attacks on Raglan, and Prince Albert called him a miserable scribbler. Pleas from newspapers resulted in more Allied officers being sent out, including Colonel Williams, who immediately requested the provision of 20,000 pairs of boots and 10,000 shirts and drawers to counter soldiers' ragged and threadbare uniforms. In response to reports of severe rank divisions, Raglan rapidly altered his style of leadership. After newspapers accused him of being invisible to his troops, he began to make more walks through the camp to talk to soldiers. Raglan adapted due to newspaper reports, becoming more accountable to the men and improving soldier morale. William Codrington, who replaced Raglan after his premature demise due to depression, which Russell's correspondences were accused of causing, issued a general order on February 25, 1856, the basis of military censorship, forbidding publication of details of value to the enemy. However, by the time this passed, hostilities had ended and its importance was ignored. During the Boer Wars and the First World War, censorship was a dominating feature of reporting, crushing correspondence into virtual silence. The lack of censorship was a key detail which allowed the First War correspondence to have such a huge impact. Crimean press reports were the core driver in implementing this restriction order, transforming the way the media reports news to this day. Government reforms were critically affected by press coverage of the war. The public already had a powerful voice, as seen in parliamentary reforms of the Glorious Revolution. However, before the Crimean War, the government had not appreciated the newspaper's potential to shape public opinion. In the same way photojournalists changed US public opinion during the Vietnam War, newspaper correspondence helped shape public understanding of events in the Crimea. Consequently, questions were asked about the war administration before it was over and forced the government to review its conduct. The lack of preparations and logistical failures, including the lack of food, warm clothing, and medical facilities, were things the government could no longer hide from the public. The Times blamed the government for not fashioning suitable winter provisions, claiming soldiers were washed out, dispirited wretches. Due to barrages of complaints in the newspapers, the government purposefully tried to improve conflict management to quell public opinion. The transformation of medical facilities followed furious press reports. Russell commonly reported the government's failure to provide enough medical staff, describing the lack of care for the wounded. Thomas Chenery, another correspondent for the Times, declared the French army, when compared to the British, were greatly their superiors. After reading Chenery's report highlighting the lack of Sisters of Charity, Secretary for War Sidney Herbert asked Florence Nightingale to volunteer. She immediately took a group of 38 nurses to Turkey and transformed British medical facilities in the Crimea. The government conducted a report into hospital conditions in British camps, which corroborated in every particular the letters of the correspondents, and they suggested a policy of reform of the government's military and medical conduct. Press reporting had huge political influence and caused the government to reevaluate their methods of administration. The Aberdeen government was forced to resign in February 1855 after an inquiry into the management of the Crimean War, caused by negative press reports, passed with an overwhelming majority, which was effectively a vote of no confidence. The government had been defeated, not by the sword of the Crimean War, but the pen. The Prime Minister's replacement was Lord Palmerston, whom Disraeli described as an old painted pantaloon. After the war, politicians had to give more attention to the press and the way the government managed information. Scottish diplomat David Urquhart, in discussing the popular silence throughout delays in establishing a new government, cites, "Heretofore, the people had leaders whom at least they knew. Now they have columns of anonymous type," in reference to the editorial leaders of the press. Many people thought the hysterical despair that engrossed the nation in 1855 was exploited and largely created by the press. By subjecting the government to constant scrutiny, newspapers highlighted important issues needing addressed and made fighting and conflict management more effective, whilst also causing the Aberdeen government to collapse. Press reports saved the military from utter negligence in the harsh Crimean conditions, and from there on were formidable forces in holding governments accountable. When Russell's friends tried to award him the title of Father of War Correspondence, he jested about the compliment and referred to himself as the miserable parent of a luckless tribe. However, Russell was a key player in transforming the public sphere. Newspaper reporting changed perceptions of the war and allowed a public forum to evolve into a community which influenced political actions and military aid. Journalists and editors rallied sentiment, resulting in improvements in fighting, living, and staying alive in the Crimea and beyond. The pen became a formidable player in social and political arenas, and from this point onwards, administrations would be foolish to underestimate the influence of the press. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lucy. Let me just remove the spotlight. Okay, I thought I did that, but okay. Okay, so have I successfully removed the spotlight? Yes, okay, thank you. We do have one question in the Q&A, which we'll get to very, very soon. I'm going to reserve any questions I have until all attendees have been able to ask whatever questions they have. But I do want to say, and I mentioned this before we went live, the title of this panel is Intellectual and Political Histories of 19th century Europe. But as I read the papers, I thought one could have, as a historian, added a whole host of other adjectives, because we're dealing with economic history, commercial history, financial history, cultural history in terms of the role of the media, the growing role of the media that Lucy just talked about, and military history as well. So I was just very impressed and interested by the scope of the three papers, and yet at the same time, I found each one of them very well researched and very well focused in on the topic. So thank you very much. And the other thing that I thought was very interesting and effective in all three papers was that each of you did a very good job of focusing on the interactions of different actors, of different historical actors. In the case of Jade, you were looking at the writings of Montesquieu and Tocqueville, but they're addressing all the different forces in society, political, social, different groups, lawyers, associations, etc. And that's a very complex story, and you did a very effective job of explaining that to us. And then, of course, our two other panelists were also dealing with different players, different historical actors. And one of the great challenges for historians is to be able to reflect and convey the complexity of a particular moment in history by addressing the different historical actors who had a say. And so the two of you also did a very good job with that. And so congratulations. I do have some questions, but we do have at least one question in the Q&A. I think it's for Ariel. Hi, Ariel. Do you see a similarity between 19th century Britain and what is going on in the world today? Do you think that the world's economic system is fragile or is it secure? Before you answer, Ariel, I will warn you that historians often get that kind of question. And the modest, humble answer that historians give is, we're bad enough at predicting the past. So it's quite a challenge to predict the future or understand the present. But the connection between a past scenario and our current situation is where historians can provide, useful insight. So take it away.
It's a really interesting question. I think that how we should understand that the impact of the British informal imperial model is that it sort of created the foundation that other, future superpowers utilized. No longer was like hard power, mercantile and military strategies the most effective or efficient way to exert influence throughout the world. It's clear that free trade and economic ties, you can read about Norman Angell in 1911 writing about this, how economic ties and unfettered free trade is the true pathway to success. And I would say even today, the Chinese Silk Road model, which isn't exclusively based off the British imperial model, but seems largely influenced by it in the sense of their foreign investment is done in such a large extent that it creates, these economic ties and influence that, we wouldn't have thought 10 years ago that China was capable of exerting. As far as the security of the global financial system today, I would say, yeah, I'm not a financial advisor by any chance. I will say in relation to the paper that I was concerned even before COVID that global corporate debt was at levels over $75 trillion. And that was before COVID, destabilized the economic system. So in that sense, I would say that there's cause for concern, but it seems that economists have figured out that quantitative easing and, funnily enough, increased money printing and money borrowing is the answer out of these problems. So in that sense, I wouldn't be too afraid, but, there are always signs for concern. Bubbles will always be present in a capitalist free market society.
Okay. Well, at this point, that is still I think the only question we have. So I would very much encourage our attendees to just type in questions, and the minute we see one pop up, we'll direct it to the panelist. So I do have some questions for each of you or comments. I was curious, Jade. You're looking at two really very influential thinkers of the early modern era. And does Tocqueville, and you see the connections and you see the influence that Montesquieu played on Tocqueville's thinking, does he ever cite Montesquieu in his writings? Does he ever refer to him in his writings? Or did you just read both and realize, wait, there's a major influence?
He doesn't explicitly cite Montesquieu, no. I mainly looked at the two works, and based off of, the implicit research questions I see in Montesquieu, I kind of tried to find that in Tocqueville. The closest thing that there is, and I thought it was very interesting, and I have this in my essay, is that in both of their introductions, Tocqueville almost verbatim says exactly what Montesquieu does. It's very interesting. It's hard to read that after Montesquieu and not go, wait a minute.
Yeah. No, you had to shorten your paper, and so you did leave out some. And I wanted you to be able to get to that point. Well done. I also wanted to point something out that I don't think you ended up including in the oral version of your paper just now. But it was very interesting to me. I work on issues of race, the development of race theories. I've just been teaching that in both my classes, my grad class and my undergraduate survey class just recently this semester. And one of the things that really fascinated me was that Montesquieu's notion of national character, some of the factors that he says condition a people's national character are climate and environment. And at the very time he was writing this, I think he was probably being influenced by some of the most prominent scientists of that era who were developing the concept of race, and they were identifying as crucial factors climate and environment as dictating a human group's racial characteristics. So I thought that there's something there that's rather interesting in terms of these intellectual elites in different fields in the 18th century, focusing on those particular sort of environmental factors as really conditioning human beings. So I just wanted to make that point that if you were ever to expand this project, there would be some pretty fascinating places to go, I think. Lucy, this was fascinating for me. I did not know that the Crimean War played this such an important role, a sort of turning point in really the history of the Western media's role in public policy. And also I thought you did a very good job early in your presentation, laying out the context, increased literacy, the libraries opening up for the public, et cetera, so that we can understand why then in the middle of the 1800s during this war, the press can suddenly gain traction in a way it never was able to, not just amongst elites, but amongst a more literate general public. One of the things that came to mind when I was reading your paper was that you're addressing one of the major methodological challenges that historians face when they're doing research. And I thought you did a very good job. And that challenge is when you're looking at the press, historians have to ask themselves, as they're looking at newspapers as primary source evidence of a particular era that they're studying, they ask themselves, okay, can I just assume that because this one journalist is writing that reflects public opinion? Is he shaping public opinion, or is he actually expressing the way the public already feels? And I thought what your paper did very well was show how this new kind of reporting on the battlefield then led to public activism. And so you demonstrated the connection, which often is hard to demonstrate for historians, between a reporter's coverage in the press and then the impact on public opinion and reactions by the public.
Thank you.
So I thought that was a very strong part of your paper. Let's see. And then I guess I'll turn to Ariel. You use some concepts that I happen to be familiar with: soft power, hard power, informal empire, formal empire. But I was wondering whether you could explain those concepts for other attendees, just in case they're not familiar with them. So what's the difference between soft power and hard power?
If you were to think about it, think of hard power as in like coercive and measures of strength to exert influence. Like think about colonial America, where there was heavy taxation, and you didn't just get sent to prison for not paying your taxes. You got sent to debtor's prison and were possibly shot. And that's how empires exerted influence, or they just exploit all your resources and kill you if you try to stop them. Soft power, conversely, is a lot more oriented on mutual cooperation and diplomacy. It's more tactful, I would say.
Yes, I think this is very, very good explanation. There's a very prominent Harvard scholar who's written a lot about this, Joseph Nye. I don't know if you know his work.
I only know Morgenthau, but
okay, yeah. And so soft power can even be very subtle ways that you can influence other nations, other populations, without, as you said, using coercive methods, whether military or economic sanctions. And so I thought that was very interesting to show how in Britain's informal empire, there was a turn to less coercive measures, and more cooperative, collaborative, but that could also pay off. And it was far less expensive than sending armies across
Absolutely. I will say, though, just for the sake of clarity, that, even in their informal empire, coercion existed. They still had usually a military presence, or I mentioned the economic leverage that they had over Latin America at this time. When you own, half a country's corporate debt while they're developing, you get to dictate a lot of what goes on in that country, regardless of how many soldiers you actually have on the ground. But you're absolutely right that at least their image was a lot less threatening.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're, in a sense, you're saying
soft
power can be more effective when hard power is lurking in the shadows nearby.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yes. So do the three of you have comments or questions on each other's papers?
I would have a question about Lucy's paper. I would say I was curious. I'm not terribly well versed in the Crimean War, but I would ask what impact the report did the impact of reporting on the Crimean War, was that like just a trendsetter? Did that become like the norm that reporting dictates public policy, or was it sort of like a one-off?
I think that's quite a big question. I think in the sense that the newspapers had expanded hugely during this time. I suppose in a way it was a trendsetter, because it was one of the first times, I would say, that the plight of the common soldier was kind of prioritized in a lot of ways over leaders such as Wolfe or Wellington, for example. So I think it did set the trend in the sense that it was one of the first times that the general sort of everyday person was being reported on in the same extent. And I think that has kept going to this day. I think as the media has expanded and the world in a lot of ways has become very interconnected, and the way I was talking about this public forum that had been developed, if you think about Twitter and Facebook and just social media in general today, it's exploded, really. Anyone can comment on anything, which I think could be seen as a more extreme version as to what happened during the Crimean War. So yeah, I would say it was a trendsetter.
Any other questions or comments you have about each other's papers?
I think there's one in the chat.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, yes, thank you. Okay, we've got another. What caused this is for Lucy, obviously, what caused the Crimean War?
Okay, that's a big question. Well, I think from what I remember, it was Britain and France and I think Turkey against Russia. Mm-hmm. And I think it started, the reason I think that people had said was that there were some monks, I think, and there was something to do with Russians attacking monks, I think, in this area. But I think the real reason, I would say, was this was the age of empire, and this was the time when countries wanted to expand, and so even if they were saying they were doing it for the sake of going against barbarism, I think the main reason was to claim more land and to claim a larger area on the globe, and I think that's the main reason. I think they used the excuse of trying to stop Russian expansion. I think that was the main concern as well. So all these things, I think, culminated in this war that shouldn't have taken that long. I think that was another thing. I think Britain went into it hoping that it was going to be a quick victory, because for them, with all these developments in newspapers, there was also huge development in technology at the time. For example, they had steel battleships or metal battleships. Their weapons had improved compared to the Russians, who still had wooden bolts. Their technology wasn't as evolved. So I think in many ways it was it was expected to be a quick victory, and they'd be able to improve their standing in the world. So I think that's why they did it. They did it because it was going to be a quicker victory. Well, they were supposed to, but it didn't turn out that way.
I would just add, I'm no expert on the Crimean War, but yes, I think you're right. This had to do with sort of great power competition, and Russia was very interested and quite determined. And it wasn't Turkey, it would have still been the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was weakening during the 19th century. And but it controlled the passage from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And the Russians, as they were becoming more ambitious, had long wanted to have a direct access to the Mediterranean Sea because, of course, of all the economic and other kind of strategic advantages that gave a great power in Europe. And so I suspect that a lot of it was over their desire to control access from Russia through the Black Sea and onto the Mediterranean Sea. And that, of course, engaged the Ottomans because they were the ones who controlled that terrain. And then the French and the British would have been concerned about Russians beginning to get access to the Mediterranean Sea, but also attacking another great power in the region. So yes, it was probably quite a complicated story, but it was not about monks as much as perhaps about the bigger picture of power and economic prospects. So well done. We've got another, this is great. We've got another question from an anonymous attendee. Jade, you used the expression groupthink. Is that another way of bullying people into agreeing?
In a way, that's definitely part of it. Groupthink is mainly when the majority has an idea and the individual kind of believes that they must be wrong and they must go with the group in order to save face or not be bullied or excluded. But it's more just kind of when 9 people out of 10 are saying this is right, that one person, unless they have at least another person to agree with them, will all just automatically assume that they're wrong. It kind of connects to what I was saying about associations, how associations help kind of mitigate this groupthink because it allows people to come together and think, well, more other people have this idea too, maybe I'm not wrong.
Thank you. Just to give people a bit more time to type, I have a question for you, Jade, as well. And this was, I think, more in the written part of your paper. I'm not sure you really delved into it in the oral presentation. But Tocqueville, on the one hand, seems to be arguing that commercialism can be good because it creates ties between different people in a society. You know, they have to come together, they have to cooperate to advance their commercial interests. And yet at the same time, he, like Montesquieu, is very critical of materialism, you know, just going after material pleasures, material benefits, profit. And yet the purpose of commercialism is ultimately profit. So is there a tension there in Tocqueville's thinking, do you think, or did I misunderstand?
No, you understood. Like both him and Montesquieu, I think, advocate ultimately for moderation. They see there are both issues with commerce and also benefits to it. And their way of thinking is that you need to identify it to be able to work around it. So for them, there's problems to commerce, but they believe through other institutions, as such as religion, that can help replace these ideals and remind people that it's okay to want to be happy in your first life, but you should also look to this other second life and moderate your own behavior. Absolutely.
Fascinating. Okay, that's very interesting. So sort of balancing things out. So commercialism up to a certain point, but then balance it out with the higher values of religious faith.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps counter individualism a lot, but it helps perpetuate materialism. Yeah. So they kind of go hand in hand, and you need other factors, kind of like monarchy, where he sees it as moderate, but it also has all these dangers, and it needs the nobility, it needs all these other intermediaries that will help moderate it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. That was a very clear and helpful answer. I think we we can go ahead and conclude. I really want to thank the attendees as for attending, and then the wonderful, encouraging chat comments from the popes. So thank you for appreciating the work of the panelists. I certainly did. I loved reading your papers, and it really generated a lot of thinking. And that's what papers are supposed to do. That's what a good history conference panel is supposed to do. So you really contributed.